Welcome to Business Smarts Radio with Tom and Dr. Dave, the clean approach to building your successful business. Now, let's introduce Tom Borg and Dr. Dave Miles. Welcome to Business Smarts Radio with Tom and Dr. Dave, where we bring you the clean approach to building your successful business. And when we mean clean, we're not talking about spick and span and dust mops. This podcast is all about the acronym CLEAN. We're all about communication, leadership, engagement.
And no drama.
And no drama. Absolutely. So today we're going to continue on a series that we've been on talking about some data-driven, assessment-based ways to improve your organization. We started out a couple of weeks ago talking about bridging performance gaps in your leadership team, talking about a critical alignment workshop. It's an assessment-based kind of data-driven team approach workshop that we use quite a bit with a lot of our clients. And we wanted to break some of these pieces down to look at individuals or look at specifics. For example, a manager direct report type relationship, ways that you could really get more of a deeper dive into really doing some engagement work with your organization. So today, our title is 2 ways to create a clear communication culture. 2 ways to create a clear communication culture. Because one of the biggest things that is a problem with most organizations, most teams, most places, is communication. I like to talk about specifically in my business is all about leadership, communication, and engagement. And to me, that's a big deal. Is everything I do looks at one of those 3 things. But even though my Ph.D is in leadership, even though my leadership's in my company name, I always start with communication because it is the most important when it comes to organizations. What are your thoughts, Tom?
Dave, not only is communication important to the organizations we work with, it's important to global politics. It's important to families. It's important to every organization we can think of. Communication is the key area. Matter of fact, it's been reported billions of dollars are lost each year on miscommunication within just businesses and organizations. So the idea is when we're talking about ways to improve communication, this is a game changer.
Oh, no, absolutely. And I, one of the things that we talked about the last couple of episodes is when you can get together with your team, whether it's a board, a senior leadership team, or like a middle management team, and you can start to understand where people are coming from. You learn about their team. You learn about the way they communicate, their behavioral style. You look at what drives them, the why behind they do what they do. Like you said, you mentioned before, is like an iceberg. You see their behavioral style, their communication style, the how of what they do, little piece of it. The part that is the big is the iceberg that you can't see is the why behind what they do.
Yeah, we don't want our listeners to be on the Titanic here and just see the tip of the iceberg and unfortunately find out too late they've hit the part that's below the surface and it's caused all kinds of damage.
Yeah, and we used an example before of somebody that you interview and she's great, and I mean just a star performer, just an absolute rock star, and just perfect interview, works out great. And then 6 months later, you're like, well, what's going on? Well, in whatever maybe the drivers are, this kind of harmonious driver where it's more of a, you have to have, you got a nice office, you've got a pleasant environment, you've got, the pictures, the plans, the stuff like that. You've got your physical environment is good. Plus just, that free of conflict from the whole area. Well, you get somebody like that and put them in a contentious situation and you've shoved them in a cubicle, even though the skills are the same, even though the job is the same, you look at just those environmental issues based on something that's a driver for them that they might not even be 100% consciously aware of. And then you wonder why 6 months later, hey, I thought this was the perfect person. Why are they not working out? They're not working out because of the environment that you put them in, because it directly conflicts with one of their innate kind of driving forces that's so important to them.
So true, David. I think that's the key for our listeners today, is to understand that communication is a multifaceted process, and the more we understand about how it works and how people operate, the better off we're all going to be.
Yes. And so the two ways that we wanted to talk about today about creating a clear communication culture was we wanted to specifically go to the report that we had referenced using in the critical alignment workshop, this trimetrics DNA report that looks at behavioral communication style, driving forces, the why behind what you do, and then the competencies, there's 25 soft skill competencies, very specific in the report. And whether using, ours, one like ours or a different one of the things that I always want to make sure is when you're trying to talk to a team and you're trying to talk to, let's say, your direct reports, there's two ways to look at things. How would you like to be communicated with? Okay, that's a big one. So ways to communicate with Joe, with Sue, with Bill. And then probably the most important, even more important on how do I like to be communicated with is a thing we call ways not to communicate with Bill, with Joe, with Sue, with Karen. And honestly, whether it's you're talking about from a leadership end of it or a communication end of it, when you've got a list of what to do and what not to do, I'm always a fan of the what not to do list is the more important list to look at. Because if you can avoid the what not to do list in communication, that's going to be the stuff that shuts people down. Not, I know what to do and I'm going to be more effective as a communicator if I do this. That's nice. That's good. Don't get me wrong. I'm not downplaying that at all. But the what not to do list. And I know you're going to give us some examples later, but if it's like whatever you do, do not be condescending, do not be demeaning, do not be whatever, they basically are like, it's a trigger list for lack of a better term.
Sure it is.
And when you come in there and you actually trigger somebody like that, it's not ineffective communication at that point. There's no communication. They're not listening to you. Now they're triggered. Their emotions are high. The EQ comes into play. I mean, it's bad all the way around. Same thing with leadership.
You bet.
I'm looking at good leaders and bad leaders. What to do if I ever become in that position on, what good leaders I've seen in this particular position, what they did, and then what not to do. I'm still the same thing, just like with communication. The what not to do list is much more important.
Yeah, that's for sure. I remember just thinking years back, I had a client and unfortunately he had a divorce shortly after we started working together. And I ran into his wife at a networking session. And one of the things she said to me, which really stuck with me, because I knew she was right on the button with it, is that her ex-husband, never could admit when he was wrong. He was always right. So whenever they had a disagreement, her husband never, ever indicated that he might have been wrong or that she was right. So what I'm saying is that can go really deep in terms of putting a wedge in a relationship. And I'm talking about not just outside work, but at work as well. So.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's both ways. It's personal, it's professional, it's in a lot of ways. If you,
yes,
like I say, we constantly bang the drum, and it's just the truth that when it comes to, we talk about clean communication, leadership, engagement, and no drama. Well, look at the engagement end of it. Engagement end of it, which has everything to do with the way you communicate and the way you lead. How engaged are you going to be when somebody is not communicating with you effectively? They're a poor leader because, honestly, like I said, we keep talking about it all the time. People don't leave organizations. People leave people. And when you're running an organization and you have middle management or upper level management and you have turnover in those departments, you got to start looking at different tools, whether it's a 360 assessment, whether it's a behavioral assessment, or whatever. Why are people leaving? And a lot of times they're just not going to tell you right off the bat. You may or may not get something in an exit interview. You may, I wouldn't count on it.
Usually not in an exit interview. They're just wanting to get the heck out of Dodge and do it in a way that's not going to threaten their future career wherever they may land up.
Exactly. And even if they have very strong opinions, do they feel comfortable giving them to you in a way that's going to be useful? Or is it or the guy that just literally wants to burn the bridge on the way out the door? Hey, I give you my 2 weeks notice, but in my exit interview, I'm going scorched earth.
That's right. Well,
more helpful than not getting any information, but still not overly productive. So there's different ways to get that kind of data. And I know we had talked about before, even a good 360 assessment is nice because it's not me telling you that you're communicating poorly. It's not these people that are accusing you of that. it's the data.
Sure. Oh,
know,
yeah.
it's like
Yeah.
the data says XYZ. So let's go over the data. So it kind of removes it and it gives that level of objectivity
Yeah.
that it really deserves.
Sure. Well, and back to our checklist for communicating. So there's
Absolutely.
things we want to really focus on today is that how to communicate with somebody and how not to communicate with somebody. So I'm going to just take a look at this report we have as a sample report, how this one particular person wanted to be communicated to. So let me just read a couple of those off. Well, this one person did, he wanted whoever was communicating to him to define the problem in writing. Okay. He wanted to see it in writing. Next, speak at a rapid pace. In other words, they didn't want people to just drag on the conversation or to speak so slowly that they didn't have the patience to want to listen to that. Another one here is look for any oversights that person might have, and then bring them out in a positive way. Say, hey, I might you might not have noticed, but there's something here that you might not have observed, and it needs to be addressed. So to do that in a tactful way, that was something the person was looking for. So if that decision maker knew that ahead of time, or his coworker knew that ahead of time, that would create a much more positive and much more fluid communication process where this person wants were being met when it came to communicating with other people, where other people are talking to that individual.
Absolutely. No, I would say that would be very important. And when you're talking about if you do have those type of assessments, one of the big things is either you have kind of yours and they have theirs, but one of the big things that is important to me is really being able to sit there and compare notes. When you look at a manager direct report dyad there, I mean, it is super important um, to be able to understand each other. We talked about value to the organization last time. And when you can understand the value that your direct reports bring to the organization, but also maybe even more important sometimes, use the example of the clinic owner, where the regional manager who is in charge of all these different clinic locations, the clinic managers could not understand why they were doing what they were doing. And it just seemed kind of almost incompatible, where they had to worry about the environment of their clinic. They had to worry about the patient care. They had to worry about all the things that made the clinic successful. But then that next step up, managing 10 or 12 clinics, they really had to see, what do we have to do to keep the business sustainable? What growth do we need to do? What is the profitability measures? Those type of things. And sometimes it seems incongruent. Like, why are we worried about that when we need to make sure the environment that our patients are in, the patient care is great? The kind of aesthetic and harmonious end of it versus kind of the pragmatic end of it. But once they understood where they were coming from because of tools like this, they were like, okay, all right, now I get it. Take away some of those misconceptions and understand where they're coming from, and it makes being able to communicate a lot easier. But I love having a list where there's like a comparison report where you have two people side by side, ways to communicate with Amy, ways to communicate with Joel, and you have 7 or 8 or 10 of them, and each of them can kind of pick their top 3 or 4 and then compare notes. And so you've got ways to communicate and then ways not to communicate, like you had mentioned as far as some examples. I have a example of a actual comparison report, and I've just made up the names as far as the change of as far as Amy and Joel. But when it says ways not to communicate with Amy, it says don't talk in a loud voice or use confrontation, don't use gimmicks or clever quick manipulations, don't make statements about the quality of your work unless you can prove it, don't be disorganized and messy, don't make conflicting statements, don't dilly-dally or waste time, don't talk to her when you're extremely angry, and don't threaten, cajole, wheedle, coax, or whimper. So she picks her top 2 or 3, but you look at the other end of it, her direct report, Joel. Don't be curt or tight-lipped. Don't ramble on. Don't be dictatorial. Don't leave decisions hanging in the air. Don't legislate or muffle. Don't over control the conversation. Don't talk down to them. Don't drive on to facts and alternatives or distractions, and don't let them overpower you with verbiage. So when you look at those things, they're completely different on what kind of triggers one versus the other, but they're both very important. And how many times would you really know about that with the other person if you didn't have that data there in front of you?
Sure. Well, so often, Dave, it's the problem is we communicate to people the way we want to be communicated to. or we don't want people to communicate to us the way we think that they don't want to be communicated the same way we don't
Right.
want to be communicated to. So what I'm
Correct.
saying is these are blind spots for us, and that's where a great report can point these things out. And you mentioned the dyad where the two people sit down and they compare notes. That's a wonderful way to do it. As you know, we also do the triads where we sit down and we facilitate discussion between each person, the report and the direct report, or in other words, the boss and the direct report, so that now we can shine a little light on some of these characteristics or some of these factors that are part of this report. We might say something like, well, Joe, could you tell us a little bit more about what that means when you say you don't want to be having someone talk down to you? Could you give us an example? Now
Yeah.
you can shine light on this type of an issue or this concern and then get it cleared up. Because again, too often people just assume that I'm doing everything right when I'm communicating with Joyce here. And as a result, I have no idea that I am offending her or that I'm just turning her off when it comes to creating that communication process that I'm really striving to create.
Absolutely. Now, a lot of it depends on the level of relationship you have. If you got six direct reports that and you and the team all
Yes,
get
that's right.
along really well, you
Different
can
people.
sit down just one on one and just
Mm-hmm.
do when you're doing your one on ones. Take these type of comparison reports and compare notes and just go over them and review them. And everybody leaves with their set of, okay, now I know more about Amy, I know more about Joel, I know whatever. But on the
Mm-hmm.
flip end of the coin, if you've got say 10 direct reports, you've got two or three that are just, or one or two that could be really contentious. Having somebody else come in and play that kind of neutral third party
Mm-hmm.
to go over all of them with them. You
Oh
might
yeah.
not need it for 7 out of 10 of them. Two of them might be important, and one of them is crucial because you don't.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what are you accusing me? I'm not accusing you of anything. Here's the data.
Mm. Dave, I know of an example where I was working with a college or university, and there was one gentleman in the office. This was in the admissions office, and he had a great voice. It was a booming voice. He could have been in. I always told him, I said, "You could be in radio. You got such a great voice." Well, there was another person that he worked with, and when they would talk, I observed that she would kind of like just cower a little bit. She just didn't
Hmm,
seem to be responding well to what he was talking about. So
right.
anyhow, the one guy left, and later I was just chatting with this one woman, and she said, I just can't stand it when he speaks. He just speaks too loud. It just
Hmm,
makes me feel like I'm being I'm just being attacked. What all she was referring to is that his volume was so loud. It was naturally loud for this gentleman. She just couldn't put up with that, and she didn't even tell him this. So the fact was, he took it as she was not agreeing with what he had to say, or she didn't like him. So
hmm.
you see how easy that we can see this misinterpretation happening if people don't understand how people want to be communicated to or not be communicated to.
Absolutely. And we've talked about this a couple times too. And I think this really goes from these types of tools help you make the transition from golden
Yes.
rule to platinum rule. I mean,
Exactly.
we're familiar with ourselves, and if we're leaders, we should have a high level or should have a high level of self awareness to
Mm-hmm.
a certain degree. Obviously, some more than others, and I firmly believe the more self aware you can be, the better off you are, especially if you're a leader. But if you worked for somebody or worked with somebody for 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years, 10 years, 12 years,
Mm-hmm.
you're going to pick up a lot of this just from natural observation. What
Mm-hmm.
worked and what didn't work. Wow, I remember I did XYZ and I came across like this to Sue, and that really didn't go over well, or to Joe, and that really didn't go over really well. I know not to do that again.
Mm-hmm.
Well, why end up being to the point where it's based on experience when you can find that out and avoid the issue ahead of time,
Oh yeah.
especially when you're looking at it from a global perspective,
Mm-hmm.
global in your organization. If making that move from kind of more the golden rule to platinum rule type of mentality with meeting people where they halfway where they like to be met.
Mm-hmm.
Think about just the HR, not just engagement when we talked about it before, but even just the HR complaints that could be eliminated from just people understanding, well, okay, if I'm talking to using the example you just used, I need to tone it down a little bit. I need to lower the volume. I don't need to have the big, long, loud DJ voice.
Mm-hmm.
When he's doing that. I mean, that's because if that is what is the barrier to communication, that might be great for the other five direct reports. But when she comes in, you need to meet her halfway. You need to tone it down a little bit. You need to soften it up, lower the volume, pause a little bit more. Just little things like that. If you realize that that is one of the triggers, because it doesn't mean that they don't agree with you. It doesn't mean they don't like you. Some people, for example, that are on the more predictable end of it when it comes to pace and consistency, they need a little bit of time to process things.
Yes.
You just can't walk in, dump something on them, and then expect an answer right away.
Right. I've seen that happen where a person is expecting an answer right away and the person's still processing the information. It's not that they're being deliberately slow. They're just that's how they process information. So what I've seen happen is sometimes the other person will say, well, what are you, stupid or something? Give me an answer here. And they just don't get that this other person has a different way of processing information and then communicating back. That again can come from a great assessment tool that will identify it in a way that is not threatening, but just says, hey, here's how it is with this person. They process information differently than you, and you need to bridge the gap there. You need to come halfway in helping them understand that.
If you're someone that's more direct and it's more, okay, gut reaction, instinctive bullet point kind of thing. Okay, well, I don't mind taking and, you give me something to ask for. So I'll just tell you the top 3 things right off the top of my head, boom, 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 and let's just go with it. Where, the other person may be like, well, what are the consequences? What are the, situations behind it? What could and couldn't happen? Those types of, so you're not springing something on them. I mean, there's just lots of little nuanced things that you can do like that.
Absolutely.
And setting up your systems and processes the way you do meetings. I mean, just a lot of different ways that can really help make your communication in your organization much more effective. So the 2 ways that we talked about today to create a clear communication culture is try to identify with all of your direct reports and your peers, whether it's through a database assessment process or whether it is just through kind of experience and anecdotes, but try to figure out in your mind those 2 lists, ways to communicate with the people that are around me, and then ways not to communicate, that are specific to them. There's some things that are just general, good business etiquette, good just etiquette in general for communications, but specific to them, what are ways that you can think of to improve the communications? And I think if you get those 2 lists of what ways to communicate with somebody effectively and ways not to communicate with them, take that into effect and start thinking more platinum rule than golden rule. How can I communicate with that person in a way that they would like to be communicated with? Not being inauthentic, not changing your style, but just being empathetic and considerate of others. I think we can certainly go a long way to improving the communication culture in our organization. What are some final thoughts you have, Tom?
Well, you're absolutely right with those final comments that you've made there. The idea is we just need to be a little bit more open-minded and look for tools that can help us be better leaders, better communicators, and I got to believe it's going to help not only the relationships, but our bottom line.
Yes, absolutely. Because like I said, the communication and leadership all leads to engagement, and engagement is where you get your productivity, your turnover. That is really where the rubber meets the road, bottom line. So I hope these tips are helpful. I challenge you all to go and find out this information. And if you're looking for something that's an assessment-based, data-driven approach, you can always reach out to Tom and I. We have our information down there. We'd be more than happy to give you a sample of one of our behavioral assessments and see if that's something that may be good for your team. Who knows? If it's a good fit, great. If not, that's fine. But we're more than happy to get that sample to you. Just reach out to us in the information below. And we will see you guys for the next Business Smarts Radio with Tom and Dr. Dave. Take care.